don't know if you saw the very, very polarized responses to my Stu Peters interview.
I haven't had a chance to see that yet.
No, nor have I, but do praise them as best you can.
Some people are saying things like, that was great, really enjoyed that. And others are saying, I'm no longer supporting UK column anymore. It's all gatekeeping. You guys are limited hangout.
Well, this is, look, Jerm, this is a common thing. It is so spectacular. I cannot quite get my head around how this works. But this is a very common thing. And the other common thread in this is the opinion that if we were to speak to someone and broadcast that therefore implies some kind of support for that individual. And sometimes this is not correct. Sometimes this is because we feel that our audience needs to hear what somebody says. There was an interview done in 2018 or something like that with General Sir Richard Barons. Now, General Sir Richard Barons is a great friend of Chris Donnelly, who most people will know was running the Integrity Initiative exercise to demonize Russia for many, many years. He's formerly NATO, and General Sir Richard Barons, of course, absolutely British military establishment, totally falls on the pro-war camp. But if we interview him, that means we support him. This is not reasonable. It's not logical. Sometimes it's good for people to hear what some people are saying, and they can draw their own conclusions. We aren't necessarily making any or taking any position on anything that anybody says. I would imagine it's the same for you.
It's very odd. So one of the comments under YouTube was, how can UK column align with Stu Peters? And it's so woke is what it is. When you completely play the man and not the ball.
This is something that I'm noticing, particularly in the last several months, that people on the right have been complaining and moaning and criticizing and so on the woke left. And what we find actually is when it suits them, they behave in exactly the same way. Exactly the same way. They deplatform people. They do all the same kinds of things that the woke left does. But when it's done on the right, that seems to be okay and acceptable. It's not acceptable. I don't agree with very much that Stu Peters says, but that's neither here nor there. You spoke to him, and I think it's important that people hear what he's saying, and then people can make up their own minds.
I think it's highly unlikely that even Stu Peters agrees with everything that Stu Peters says. But,
I mean, he's sensational. That's what it is. I mean,
exactly.
Just look at all the bling.
Yeah, but I think the greater point is exactly that. Just set people thinking about certain ideas, and if that points you in a direction that you find interesting. I was just thinking this morning how I have to say I can't remember, but as I'm sure I've mentioned before, haven't had a television for 25 years. And so I'm you might say, somewhat out of touch. But when I come down to Plymouth, which I do on a fortnightly basis, I get to watch about half an hour's worth of BBC morning news. And there are many features or factors that are common through every single program. But the one that seems so blatant now is the promotion of some sort of pharmaceutical product. And this morning it was an Alzheimer's drug that Institute for Clinical Excellence has just said, yes, it's good or something. I mean, I did actually hear the word safe and effective from the Alzheimer's bloke. So, reassuring to see that people are sticking with these themes. But the idea that is so therefore I shouldn't watch the BBC. I want to watch it because I want to understand what is being put out and then to consider why and to better understand why people believe what they believe. So you can treat anybody like that. I mean, Stu Peters obviously has an enormous audience, and it is therefore of interest to look at the sorts of things that he's talking about. To bring that all the way back to, right, well, that must mean that UK column thinks X, Y, and Z, and that we only have one way of looking at a particular subject is frankly, really short-sighted distillation, but also just a limiting one, because it means that you're constantly having to act like a pinball going from UK column, where suddenly you find it's dead end because you think Stu Peters is X, Y, or Z, and therefore you don't want to have anything to do with UK column on that basis. Well, where'd you go? It's a sort of, it's a game that doesn't really end up lasting very long. It's not very satisfactory.
I actually did find one point of interest from something he said. He's opposed to immigration, legal or illegal, and I found that a fascinating idea. So perhaps we could just expand on that just a little bit, because I've never actually thought about the idea of immigration itself being a bad idea until perhaps you consider something like China or Japan that doesn't really allow immigration. You can be a resident, but you can't become Chinese unless you are Chinese, if that makes sense. What are your views on that? It's actually an interesting discussion.
Well, I'd be really interested to hear exactly how he articulates that. But as a matter of interest, did you get on to emigration?
Well, so for example, you know about the South Africans that have been given hilariously refugee status in the US, right? Which I think is very unfortunate, because it makes me as a white South African look ridiculous. Like I need to be a refugee and saved by Trump, which of course, and on the face of it, it's absurd. He would be opposed to that because the white South Africans are not American.
Okay, but sorry, what I meant was I assume he's talking about the United States, and he's saying that there should be no inward migration into the United
Correct.
States.
Yes, immigration
if
with an
if you
I.
are there, but if you are there, does he have a view on whether or not you should be able to leave?
Well, he wants everybody who's not American to leave, to be...
Okay, but what if you are American and you think, well, I'd love to go and do something in Angola? Does he have a view on that? The reason I ask is because, say, countries like New Zealand have a massively transient population, and one of their issues is a sort of skills deficit, because people go abroad and practice all the things they've learned in New Zealand elsewhere, and the feeling is that therefore their services and their economy suffers as a result of it. And in the United Kingdom, the Shetland Islands have a sort of similar thing. Island population, lots of people go away to have experience elsewhere, but of course that they're therefore creating a void in Shetland. So if you're saying that you don't want people coming in, and that presumably is based on some semblance of an idea that talks about the concentration of a particular population, is it consistent then that you should say, right, well, those people need to commit to acting in the service and to the benefit of this country, and therefore they cannot leave either?
Yeah, and look, I would add to this, because how far do you take it? There are parts of southern Italy, there are parts of southern France where, basically there's nobody under the age of 70 living in towns, villages, or whatever, because there's no economy, and they've all migrated to the big cities to get jobs. And as a result, the local mayors are offering, all kinds of incentives to try to encourage people to come back. Do you take that? You may not leave your 15-minute area. How far do you take this? Now, I would qualify this and say I would personally be certainly against the policy of weaponized migration, which is something that we are without doubt witnessing at the moment. This has been weaponized, as being used as a tool of destruction for societies and for cultures, and that is absolutely something that should be resisted. But, I myself have moved to other countries for work and so on, because I wanted to experience working in those countries. If you're going to tell me that I shouldn't be allowed to do that, then I couldn't agree with that position, because that was something that I found personally an enriching part of my life. And so, it's the weaponization and the trafficking and that the what we would all consider to be, and I don't want to use the word illegal in the sense of illegal migration, migration, because actually in Britain, for example, and in Europe, the biggest part of the problem is so-called regular migration, where we are actively encouraging people to come and offering all kinds of channels for them to come so-called legally, and that while at the same time not increasing our population densities, but not providing the infrastructure to support these people. So that I would say absolutely needs to be resisted. But the idea of resisting all migration it just seems nonsensical to me. Because, for example, we hear people complaining and whining about Muslims taking over Christian churches and turning them into mosques. And I'm thinking to myself, well, hold on a second. That couldn't have happened if you were a Christian and you'd been attending that church. The reason that has happened is because that church is closed, because you haven't bothered getting off your backside to go to that church and make that a viable operation. So, we're busy complaining about, this isn't something I'm saying, this is something I hear others say. We're complaining about the reproduction rate of certain demographics in the UK while the white population isn't breeding. Why? Why are you complaining about that? What are you doing to resolve the fact that we are being outbred? If that is the case, what are you doing to resolve the fact that we are being outbred? Right. So there are many economic reasons why people are not having babies from the so-called indigenous population. There are many other reasons. Why aren't we actually supporting and
having more sex?
Well, no, but it's even beyond that. It's our entire culture. We have for the last 50, 60 years abandoned the idea of being British. We've abandoned that. And then when others come in and suddenly it's perceived as a threat and we're complaining about it, this problem didn't start 10 years ago when the serious levels of migration started. This problem started 60 years ago when we started walking away from and being embarrassed about our flag and turning the idea of national identity into something that was representative of right-wing extremism, right? This is something we did to ourselves, and we cannot blame immigrants for that. That's our problem.
I don't know if you saw my discussion with Simon Roche. 100 years ago, the year 1925, white people made up around 27 to 30% of the world population. Now it's below 10%. Whose fault is that?
It's economy. First of all, the fact that 60 years, 50 years ago, people could buy a home based on one person's salary. That it didn't cost 50% of your combined income in order to provide childcare for your children. It's the fact that we constantly move away from the older generation, so we have no support for childcare and these kinds of issues. So, there's that. There's a whole range of different reasons why we are not producing children at the moment. Lifestyle, the food that we eat, the air that we breathe, all these reasons are reducing fertility rates. But the economic part of it has to be addressed first, because if people can't afford to have children, which is the main reason people aren't having children at the moment, then of course they're going to be discouraged from doing that.
An extension of that talking point is, what does it mean to be British, or what does it mean to be South African? So my country is a complete mess, as you know, right? So if you had to ask me what is a South African, I can't answer that question. I don't know.
I was thinking about this last night, in fact. Certainly the idea of white British being one distinct culture, I think, is long gone. If really it ever existed, I think that's the other issue with this is, and I know we have touched on this before, but exactly how far back are you going to talk about Simon's statistic of 10% of the world population being white? It's just fascinating that we would look at it in those terms. The United Kingdom, and indeed South Africa, but the United Kingdom, let's say, which has had, as far as we're aware, throughout history, a white population, has been a constant battleground between rival groups of white people who have had very, very bloody conflicts. And yet from that, we're trying to suggest that we are a unified race, as it were, which we're not, and we can't possibly be. So the whole migration, inward migration issue is a massive intellectual fudge anyway, because in actual fact, if you examine your bloodline, if that's what this is about, then you will either find that you have come from, say, the Western Isles or Ireland, or indeed Northern Europe, Scandinavia, or slightly further east, somewhere in what would now be Germany. I mean, I'm speaking broadly, but we can trace that part of history relatively accurately. And so the idea that if you have Pictish or Celtic heritage or Saxon or Anglo or whatever, that now doesn't matter because the common factor is that we're white and therefore we are a nation. Well, when did that happen? Why did that get decided? But anyway, sorry, to get to the point, I was walking last night and I saw a white British girl who had tattooed on her sort of upper back 3 crescent moons with a star in it, basically Islamic symbolism. And it just made me think about the way that cultures express themselves. And to answer your question insofar as, is there a British culture? Look at the body art that people wear and find me people who are decorated with symbols that are British. Okay, I'm speaking generally, but tattoos, by and large, sported by Brits, are either sort of bits of arcane or obscure language that don't actually really make any sense to anyone except for them, but often they're in a non-British script, or they are images or symbols from other parts of the world. So don't tell me that there are people in Japan who are wearing tattoos with I can't even think what, like a stick of rock or I don't know what, sunburn or something on them. So we haven't managed to export any cultural significance to anyone else that has made them think, yeah, okay, I am Japanese or I'm New Zealand or whatever, but actually what I want to have inked onto me for the rest of my life is a symbol that doesn't reflect the culture I belong to. It's going to be from somewhere else. And okay, it might be a minor point, although, of course, as we know, tattoos are on the up and up and up. So it is kind of significant. And if you stop and ask somebody in the street, I don't think they would ever have given it a second thought. Do you consider yourself British? Oh, yeah, absolutely, because I drink 10 pints of Stella every night. And, I'm absolutely purebred. And yet I'm decorated with icons that I have no idea about their origins, genesis, meaning, anything, but they look good, and there we go. So no, I don't think there really is. And also, as I say, this relates to the wider issue of the sort of line drawing thing. So to go back to Stu Peters, and okay, I don't want to concentrate on necessarily him, but it's not an uncommon message to say, okay, we have a nation, and he's talking about the United States, but like the UK, it is a massive melting pot, and I'm talking about the white people. White people have come from all over to form that society.
Well, and that's the complete irony of what he's saying. We should ban all migration. The United States is a country of migration. The indigenous population is sitting in small packs of land around the countryside. In the meantime, the vast majority of the population are all immigrants, and now he wants to stop immigration. Well, that's the whole basis of your country, and that's something that I think Stu has missed or has conveniently wanted to forget in this conversation.
Yeah, and also the slightly less palatable truth or issue is the undertone to all of this. I'm certainly not accusing him of, or anyone else who holds these views, of, say, racism, because it's so idle and unfounded. That's not what I mean. But even if, like Simon Roche does, which I think he articulates really well, you're making a distinction between people of, say, different colours, because it's so obvious, you can see it at first glance. And he's absolutely right in that people do, when the chips are down, they gravitate back towards people who are most like them. And that doesn't matter really whether that's on family or, a business, or whether you're in the army or whatever it is, but you do gravitate back towards those that you feel safest around. It's entirely natural and there's no getting away from it. But the point, I think, of all of this bit is slightly losing my thread as I say it, which is annoying because it was so much in the front of my mind when I started that sentence. But it's yes, for it to come down to cut. Yes, that's what it is. Sorry, it's the inference that there is something about coloured immigrants into a white country like, say, the UK or the United States. There's a sort of lazy inference that these people are somehow useless, drawing off the state, taking all the money, blah blah blah, generally bringing society down. Of course, the unpalatable bit is to say, okay, well, let's just look at society as a whole and consider who is useless and who is useful, because that's ultimately sort of where this is going. And if you look at the white population of the United Kingdom, there are a lot of very useless people who are not contributing to society. So what do we do? Do we get rid of them? Or do we say, no, we'll keep them because they're white and they're British, even though they're totally useless? So in a way, where does this debate, if that's what one wants to call it, where does it go? What's the ultimate aim? Because just penning people of the same colour or nation into the same place, how sure are we that guarantees good outcome?
I think that if we look at what the biggest immigration-related problems are in Britain over the last period of time, I would say that at least as important, and something which is never discussed, is the immigration of so-called culture from other countries. I'm thinking about Hollywood, for example, and the complete destruction of people's minds that have come from that part of the United States, from the US gaming industry, from social media. It's all come from California. We have imported this stuff into our countries, and it has destroyed our countries. And this isn't something that was done by a Pakistani or an Indian or an African. This is something that was done by other white people in a part of the United States. We can't ignore that from the conversation.
I mean, I've said that also. For example, in the COVID era, the people here, at least in South Africa, who got themselves jabbed like cattle lining up to be branded, in the main were the white middle class and upper class by far.
Yeah, I mean, this is okay. The percentage weightings, obviously, South Africa versus UK are very different in terms of black, white, but the parallels are amazing. And in fact, we'll be putting it out fairly shortly, but Monty Toms, who does some excellent out and about sort of street interviews for UK Column, has just dealt with the issue of digital ID, which I would say is so very obviously a terrible idea on absolutely whichever level you want to examine it. And he went out onto the street in London, and okay, with all these things, you can always say, well, it's just sort of potluck, depends who you get on the day, very small sample size, blah, blah, blah. But what was really indicative or illustrative or informative, instructive from his most recent one was that there were two, a young white man and a young white woman, not with each other, not related, but interviewed separately about digital ID, who both said exactly the same thing, which was, yeah, it's just a great idea, having everything in one place. I mean, how incredibly convenient. And they were so obviously a product of the UK's education system, having gone through school and critically university, where they were effectively, indoctrinated, brainwashed, whatever. And everybody else that he spoke to who were not of the, let's say, sort of modern, progressive, educated class took it at face value. And even if they hadn't heard about it, just their snap judgment on, is it a good idea to have all your data in one place and have it controlled by somebody else? They said, no, that sounds like a terrible idea. And then that question was superseded by, do you trust the government? The answer to which was no. And then it was, right, so what do you think about the government having all of your data in the same place? By which time they're virtually running off down the street. So, and yet these two white people, and yes, okay, there's only two people in the whole of London and blah, blah, but they absolutely do speak for a class of people who have this sort of almost unthinking arrogance to consider that they're a product of a system that they trust implicitly, that it is looking after their best interests, and that everybody should just sign up. And this is, of course, we go back to the safe and effective and all the other massive pitfalls that people have just walked headlong into. But it was so interesting. And the number of people that Monty spoke to were black. I'm trying to think. I think perhaps one or two Asian people as well. But all of whom saw through this. And I'm trying to make some sort of racial ethnic profiling thing, but it was just very interesting that this idea of whiteness, culture, national thing, whatever, going back to the what is the benefit? What do I really want to be stuck in a country with a bunch of people who say, yeah, digital ID is such a good idea because it's all your stuff in one place. How terribly convenient. Let's all be white together. It's just crazy, isn't it?
Okay, so let's look at South Africa, for example. The Zulu nation doesn't include white people. But, however, and I've thought about this, how important is that?
We are, for the last 30, 40 years, been told all about diversity. We've got to have diversity. And as a result, we've ended up with people being given diversity training, for example. Now, what is the purpose of diversity training? The purpose of diversity training is to actually break down any sense of pride in your nationhood, in your history, and where you've come from, right? And to say that you, the black man, are the same as you, the white man, or the same as you, the Asian. What that does is that actually removes diversity, right? Because we've all grown up in cultures. We have a language which expresses things in particular. There's we all know this. There are other parts of the world with other languages where the concepts that are expressed by those languages aren't even translatable because the concepts and the words don't exist in the other language that you're wanting to translate into. That's true diversity. Having a diversity of cultures, being proud of the culture that you're part of, that brings strength to the human race because it brings a diversity of ideas and concepts and so on. Now, of course, the converse of that is that there's potential for conflict, but we could choose to grow up and abandon the conflict and actually appreciate, right? But diversity, the modern idea of diversity breaks down the differences, and actually what they're attempting to do is turn everybody culturally into the same thing. And that's something we absolutely should resist. But of course, we can only do that if we understand, which comes back to your earlier point, we can only do that if we understand what our culture is supposed to be. And I'm not sure that I do. I'm not sure that there are very many people actually do understand. And certainly from the idea of, what does British actually mean? Britain is a nation of three, supposedly a nation of three separate countries. There's actually quite a bit of diversity, even within the UK, between the various peoples that are here. So I'm not sure that there's even there's even such a thing as British. But nonetheless, getting back to the main point is that this idea of diversity is actually something which is 180 degrees from what diversity actually means, and actually it's turning us all into the same thing. I've said this many times, but when I was growing up, we had Paddy Englishman, Paddy Irishman, Paddy Scotsman jokes. And we took the mickey out of each other's cultures. The Scottish are tight-fisted money-wise. The Irish are all drunks. The English are so insignificant. I'm not even sure what they were supposed to be. But no. Well, anyway. The point is, we recognized our own feelings. We were happy to make a joke of them. We were happy to laugh at ourselves as much as, but we're so scared to laugh at ourselves anymore. We're so scared because we take offense at the slightest thing that anybody says. We've all just got to grow up, I think, is basically where we need to start.
When I was in Paris, it's beautiful, and etc. And there's obviously history and buildings and all that sort of stuff. That's wonderful to look at. But I remember saying to my wife, I want to see France. I don't feel like I'm experiencing French culture. There's McDonald's and the Burger King, and everything is international, which we have back home.
You could go to most cities in what we describe as the Western post-industrial sort of modern world, and they are, by and large, in the way that they run, homogenous. They exactly like you say, they've all got the same multinationals with their horrific outlets selling junk or junk media or, junk clothes or fake this and that and the other. So in some sense, it could be anywhere. Of course, you have this phenomenal historical, architectural or visual backdrop, like Paris, being a very good example, of course, very beautiful. But when you look now at all the other bits that are sort of overlain, they are pretty dreadful and dull because you get them everywhere. So yes, I think to go out further away from that, where those influences can't manifest, then you see a society which is trying to preserve its way of life. And that is what culture comes back to. I mean, I think France is very distinct from the United Kingdom in that respect, in that you go to the majority of, I'm being particular with a focus on England, but a lot of English villages now will have no way of life that could be described as distinctly British in the way that they might have done 50 or more years ago, in that the vast majority will have a church that is largely dormant because people don't attend it anymore. They will not have a post office or a village shop because they will have decided that the convenience and cheap allure of supermarkets was what they wanted to go for, and now they probably don't even rue the day, but obviously that's meant that any sense of local service, community hub, blah blah blah, has all disappeared. So the idea of the preservation of a way of life in many parts of the United Kingdom, particularly in England, I think has albeit all but evaporated. France less so. And I think to go back to what you were saying about, say, the Zulu nation, we see that there is a much more concerted effort to preserve a way of life. And if that involves making sure that the people that make up that nation are from the same genetic, ethnic heritage, and that makes sense to them at that time, then so be it. And let's not forget that, particularly with Zulus, that we don't go terribly far back to remember what this is or was all about, which was conflict. It was asserting your identity on a particular way of life or a particular territory by either the use of force or the resistance of force. But as time has gone by, that has by and large fallen away. And so therefore, in order to preserve the way of life that we consider important to us, we are looking for other capabilities. And so the trying to progress traits such as strength and athleticism and war fighting, which would make sense on say a sort of ethnological basis, that's no longer valid. And so going back, in the UK, go back to 2020, when it really did feel like the walls were closing in and the tyranny was absolute because people were really having their way of life compromised. The important thing then was to find people who shared that belief. It didn't or shouldn't have mattered what their background, colour, ethnicity, age, or anything was. And that was because we weren't in a situation of needing to physically fight. That's long gone. So I think we're in this odd age in this part of the world, in what we call developed part of the world, where we're wanting to form as groups, but not for the same reasons. And therefore, we're still sort of casting about in the wind to work out exactly how best to do that. But the thing people sort of fall back to is this idea of nation through a visible connection to other people, exactly like Zulu. But I think, unless I got it wrong, Zulu linguistically and sort of ethnically are close to Xhosa. Is that Isn't that right?
Similar, but quite different.
Exactly, but that's the point. They are very distinct. Whereas here in the United Kingdom, Angles and Saxons and Normans and Celts and Picts all live alongside each other, largely oblivious to the incredible conflicts of the past. And they consider that they're all now British, which of course is a nonsense. If you went into Natal, KwaZulu-Natal now and said to a Zulu, by the way, you know, in how many years' time, somebody in the Cape or in the Transkei will be the same as you, they dismiss it out of hand.
You need to differentiate. I think on a micro level, multiculturalism is fine. You can have neighbors who look and are different to you in every way. I mean, there's no problem. I have black friends and Indian friends and whatever else, right? But I think as you see with what's happening in Europe, you have on a macro level a situation that is not really cohesive. Apartheid was an interesting example, and that's a discussion for a different day because it's highly complex. But the original intention of apartheid was not based on white hatred for blacks. It was based on the fact that the two simply cannot work together under the same roof because, number one, they had different languages and different ways of operating. So it would have been best to have divided the country with a border. And as the saying goes, borders make the best neighbors. Now, of course, the system became highly corrupted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that on a macro level, this can work, I think is fairly clear internationally that it doesn't. But on a micro level, it's absolutely fine. If you just leave people alone, they get on fine.
They do. But it does go back to the motivation of threat and exactly what it is. Going back to this preservation of a way of life, what it is that is the foremost pressure on that, and therefore what recourse you're going to take in order to preserve that life. And there, you know, it's so common for there to come points where factions develop because that sense of integrity does actually dissolve at some point, because whatever it is, I mean, I know it seems ridiculous now, but because you're not the same color, or you're not from the same part of that country, or not from the same family, or whatever. But this is when the pressure is on. These are the things that turn out to matter.
If I had a neighbor who was ethnically and culturally very different to me, no issue. But if I had a neighbor who decided to slaughter a cow in the back garden in a way that just I don't appreciate, it doesn't work with my own slaughtering of cows, for example, right? I have it done at a butcher, not in a back garden where it's noisy and animals screaming and the whole thing is blood everywhere. But they could argue, yeah, but that's our custom. Now we have an issue, because what happens now?
This is exactly what I go back to in terms of preserving a way of life. So it's kind of academic as to whether your neighbour doing that is black, white, or green. It's rather more to do with the fact that they, like you say, they've come from a social grouping that does that thing in that particular way. And to go back to the Zulus, let's say, because there is a discernible way in which Zulu people do continue to live, then there'd be no barrier. I mean, they would all do it in the same way. That is part of what belonging to that society is about, and that's what I mean in terms of what we have lost. So the idea, in Britain, that we do things in one particular way is absolute rubbish. We completely do not do it, and so it's complete potluck now. I mean, I might find that I had a neighbour who was a different colour from me, but shared a view of how a certain thing would be done. And I would say that if somebody's slaughtering a cow in their back garden and it's making any noise, they have got something very wrong, because I would advocate for anything to happen outside of an abattoir. But that's perhaps a discussion for next week. The point is that, as I say, because this conflict, we hope, doesn't exist anymore, the basis of culture, ideology, belief is on these sorts of practices, and therefore we seem to have moved beyond, at least in the UK, a time where you can look at somebody and discern whether or not they're going to want to behave in a particular way over a particular issue, and whether or not that's going to be similar to you or different. Previously, we would have been able to do that. You would have been able to distinguish between white groups. You can look at people now and take a fairly educated guess as to what their ancestry is just by the shape of their face and their body. It's more difficult to do now because we are much more of a mixture.
Let's be honest. We can all agree that that nobody wants gingers around. Tough crowd.
Yeah, really tough crowd. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, things like that, I have never ever understood. The sort of the characteristic.
Charles, it's a joke.
It is a joke, but it's such an extraordinary one because the archetypal image of a claymore wielding Scot with his kilt flying behind him is always a flaming redhead. He's like the bravest of the brave. I can't think of a similar joke where the sort of apex of whether it's masculinity or strength or agility or whatever is lampooned in that way. It's so bizarre. But yeah, I do appreciate that it is a joke, but thanks very much for pointing it out. But in fact, part of that, of course, is the fact that even talking about this kind of thing might be regarded as being sensitive. I mean, why on earth would it be? If we were talking about people who had big hands or big feet, as though that was in some way a defining national characteristic, and that's how people
or red hair,
or red hair, and that's how people decided which group they would belong to. I mean, okay, there would therefore be a media propaganda campaign in order to make that a sensitive issue. But the point is that we are kowtowing to the narrative in the first place by even considering that it should be sensitive. Why? You don't have any control over what colour you turn out to be. I mean, why on earth would it be sensitive? It's only sensitive if you fall into the massive trap of saying, oh yeah, actually, there are sort of, I don't know, intellectual differences between people, and therefore, we have to be really sensitive, or because we can't possibly say that white people are this and somebody else that. We are all different. That should absolutely be acknowledged. But to draw the inference from that therefore, well, it's too sensitive to talk about because we're different is absolutely absurd and pathetic.
Well, I think actually, intelligence is something that we should absolutely be looking into. I mean, for example, the intelligence of the average MP. There's a grouping that I think we can universally and blanket say are thick as two short planks. But they seem to come from all kinds of different backgrounds these days. So, I don't think it matters what color, religion, whatever these people are. Let's put them in a box and just put them over there and say stupid. That would be a good start, I think. And maybe then the rest of us can get on with building our lives. Look, the bottom line here is the whole notion of protected characteristics is something that has been created in order to, first of all, it does a couple of things that are really detrimental to the conversation. And if we're getting worried about even having a conversation like the one that we've had, then that just demonstrates how far we've fallen. The fact of the matter is that as soon as you say to someone you have a protected characteristic, first of all, that is telling them very, very sternly that they are somehow inferior. And that therefore that characteristic needs to be protected because it's an inferior thing. And to the person who wants to criticize that characteristic for some reason, you're saying to them, no, you can't do that, so you just shut up. Well, This first of all stops the conversation. It increases the frustration. It's part of the mechanism by which racial tensions, religious tensions, skin color tensions, sexuality tensions are built, and it is a psychological operation. It's something which is being done to us all, and it is there to divide, because when we're divided, we're weak. It's time that we as ordinary people from whatever religion, culture, background, whatever, recognize that our enemy isn't each other, and our enemy is something else, and we need to start having conversations about what that enemy actually is.
Exactly. So I said to a friend of mine last week that my enemies are not those to the left and right of me, but those probably above me.
Again, going back to this idea of nationhood and peoples and all the rest of it, and what it is to be part of that, it is interesting that I think what never gets talked about is that if we are to have this idea that we have come from somewhere, is it appropriate that we should have just one sort of leadership body, as it were? The United States has one president for all those people, for all those white people who are, as Stu Peters would put it, sort of part of the American nation. But of course, they're not. They've all come from all over the place. So it is really the expansion of the colonial project, in that you're managing everybody by creating leaders a little bit further down the pecking order, and therefore homogenizing groups in order that you end up with this pyramid with one person at the top of it and everybody sort of falling into line. So it is interesting that it does conform to that way of ruling people.
Okay, final thought, Mike.
Yeah, I don't really have any final thoughts on it. I think this conversation is one that's going to rumble on. I hope that what we've discussed today is highly controversial. I hope it causes at least as a determined response as the Stu Peters interview did, and I hope that it causes people to think. I'm not going to say that everything, that my views are the right views, and everybody's got to believe what I believe. In fact, I would say quite the opposite. People have got to challenge conceptions, and that applies to ourselves.